The mop bucket wheels squeaked against the polished concrete as Marcus Castellano pushed it down the main corridor of Fort Brennan. 3 junior officers approached from the opposite direction, their conversation loud enough to carry across the space between them. "Think maintenance even has security clearance to be in this wing," Lieutenant Torres asked his companions. "The guy looks like he wandered in from the unemployment line." Marcus kept his eyes forward, continuing his methodical path toward the administrative offices. His civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a worn flannel shirt marked him as distinctly separate from the crisp uniforms surrounding him. The bucket's squeaking seemed to announce his presence to everyone within 50 feet. "Sir, maybe we should check his credentials," suggested the second officer, a young woman whose name tape read Petrov. "Base security has been tightened since the Inspector General's visit." The third officer, Captain Webb, according to his insignia, slowed his pace as they drew closer to Marcus. His expression carried the particular mix of suspicion and authority that came with recent promotion. "You there, maintenance," Webb called out sharply. "What's your clearance level for this section?" Marcus stopped pushing the bucket and turned to face the 3 officers. His weathered hands remained steady on the mop handle as he met Webb's stare directly. "Level 2 facilities access, sir. Issued yesterday morning by base operations." Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations with veterans in your community, people whose service went unrecognized in everyday settings. Webb's eyebrows raised slightly at the formal response, but his skeptical expression remained unchanged. "You understand this wing houses classified briefing rooms. We can't have random civilians wandering around with cleaning supplies." The word random hit Marcus like a physical blow, though his face showed nothing. 43 years of life had taught him when to speak and when to remain silent. This moment clearly called for silence. Lieutenant Torres stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper, but carried clearly in the corridor's acoustics. "Guy's probably some veteran who couldn't cut it in the real world. Half these maintenance contracts go to charity cases who need the work." Marcus's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the mop handle. The metal felt familiar in his hands, though for reasons these young officers would never guess. He'd held many things in his lifetime, some much heavier and more consequential than cleaning equipment. Captain Webb pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a personnel directory. "What's your name for the record? I want to verify your employment status and clearance level." "Marcus Castellano, sir. Employee number 7749 with Pinnacle Facility Services." Webb's fingers moved across his phone screen with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to bureaucratic verification. His 2 companions flanked him like sentries, their attention focused entirely on Marcus, as if he posed some imminent security threat. The corridor's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the group, illuminating the stark contrast between the officers' pressed uniforms and Marcus's civilian attire. Other personnel moved past them with barely concealed curiosity, their conversations dropping to whispers as they observed the impromptu interrogation. Petrov crossed her arms and shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I still think we should escort him to security for proper verification. Protocol exists for a reason, especially with someone who clearly doesn't belong in this environment." Marcus remained motionless during their discussion, his patience honed by decades of experience these officers couldn't begin to imagine. The bucket beside him contained industrial-grade cleaning solution that filled the air with a sharp chemical scent, mixing with the underlying odors of floor wax and recycled air that characterized every military facility he'd ever known. Webb finally looked up from his phone, his expression showing mild surprise. "Well, your employment checks out. Pinnacle does have the contract for this wing, but I'm noting this encounter in the daily log. Security needs to know when contractors are working in sensitive areas." "Understood, sir," Marcus replied, his voice carrying no trace of the emotions churning beneath the surface. Torres shook his head and began walking away, his parting comment drifting back toward Marcus. Unbelievable what passes for security screening these days. They'll hire anyone with a pulse and a mop. The three officers continued down the corridor, their conversation resuming its previous volume as they moved away from Marcus. Their laughter echoed off the walls, punctuated by Webb's voice carrying clearly back toward him. "Did you see how he just stood there?" Webb said to his companions. "Probably used to taking orders from people in uniform. Some habits never break, I suppose." Marcus watched them disappear around the corner before resuming his work. The mop moved across the floor in steady, efficient strokes that spoke of muscle memory and practice technique. Each movement was precise and economical, betraying a discipline that had nothing to do with janitorial training. The administrative wing stretched ahead of him, its doors marked with official seals and security warnings that might have intimidated someone else. To Marcus, they were simply obstacles to navigate while completing his assigned tasks. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous-looking doors often concealed the most mundane realities. As he worked, other personnel continued to pass by, most barely acknowledging his presence. A few nodded politely, but the majority treated him as part of the building's infrastructure, no more worthy of attention than the security cameras or fire extinguishers mounted on the walls. The bucket's wheels resumed their rhythmic squeaking as Marcus moved deeper into the wing, each revolution marking another step in what appeared to be a simple maintenance routine. But appearances, as he well knew, could be devastatingly deceptive. The base cafeteria hummed with the familiar sounds of military life during lunch hour. Trays clattered against metal rails, conversations mixed with the hiss of industrial coffee machines, and boots struck linoleum in the steady rhythm of personnel moving through serving lines. Marcus pushed his supply cart between the tables, methodically replacing salt shakers and napkin dispensers while trying to remain invisible. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez looked up from her turkey sandwich as Marcus approached her table. She glanced at his civilian clothes and immediately shifted her conversation to her dining companion, Staff Sergeant Kim. "Think they background check these contract workers?" Rodriguez asked, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for discussing security concerns. "Guy's been wandering around the base for 3 days now. Nobody seems to know his story." Kim paused mid-bite and studied Marcus as he worked 2 tables away. His movements were efficient and unobtrusive, but something about his bearing caught her attention. The way he carried himself suggested familiarity with military environments that went beyond recent employment. "Probably some local hire trying to make ends meet," Kim replied, though her voice lacked complete conviction. "Maintenance companies pick up whatever labor they can find. Half the time these guys are between jobs or washing out of other careers." Marcus continued his work, replacing condiment bottles with the same methodical precision he'd demonstrated in the administrative wing. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, betraying a discipline that extended far beyond janitorial duties. Each motion was economical and purposeful, suggesting training that had nothing to do with facilities management. At a nearby table, 3 junior enlisted personnel watched Marcus with barely concealed amusement. Private Chen leaned forward, lowering his voice to what he considered a whisper, but which carried clearly across the dining area. $10, says the old guy drops something before he finishes this section, Chen said to his companions. "Look at those shaky hands. Probably hitting the bottle to deal with whatever failure landed him here." Private Martinez laughed and shook his head. "Nah, I've seen guys like this before. Probably got laid off from some factory job, and now he's taking whatever work he can find. Civilian world's tough when you don't have any real skills." The third soldier, Private Watson, studied Marcus more carefully than his companions. Something about the contractor's posture and movements seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place the source of his recognition. "I don't know," Watson said slowly. "Guy moves like he knows his way around military installations. Could be former service, trying to stay connected to the life." Chen dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. If he was military, he'd have veteran preference for better jobs than this. Nobody with real service time ends up pushing a mop cart unless they seriously screwed up somewhere along the way. Marcus reached their table and began replacing the napkin dispenser, his proximity making their conversation temporarily uncomfortable. The three soldiers fell silent, watching him work with a mixture of curiosity and superiority that often characterized interactions between active duty personnel and civilian contractors. The new napkin dispenser clicked into place with a satisfying snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Marcus moved on to the next table without acknowledging their stares, his face maintaining the neutral expression he'd perfected over decades of navigating challenging social situations. Rodriguez finished her sandwich and stood up, gathering her tray while continuing her assessment of Marcus to Kim. I still think security should run a deeper check on these contractors. Times are different now. Can't be too careful about who we let wander around the base. Kim nodded in agreement, though her attention remained focused on Marcus's movements. There was something about his efficiency and precision that didn't match the dismissive assumptions her colleagues were making. His technique suggested experience with military protocols that went beyond recent orientation training. Across the cafeteria, Master Sergeant Patterson observed the scene while finishing his coffee. As the senior non-commissioned officer present, he noticed the civilian contractor's presence over the past few days, but hadn't given it much thought until now. The way younger personnel were discussing the man triggered his protective instincts regarding both military tradition and basic human dignity. Patterson approached Marcus's position near the condiment station, his expression neutral, but his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Everything going smoothly with your work assignments?" he asked Marcus directly. Marcus looked up from organizing ketchup packets, meeting Patterson's gaze with steady eye contact that suggested comfort with military authority structures. "Yes, Master Sergeant. No issues with access or equipment." Pinnacle briefed me thoroughly on base protocols. The response surprised Patterson, both in its formality and its familiarity with military courtesy. Most civilian contractors addressed non-commissioned officers casually or awkwardly, uncertain about proper etiquette. This man's response carried the automatic respect of someone accustomed to military hierarchies. "You seem comfortable with military environments," Patterson observed, his tone inviting explanation without demanding it. Marcus resumed organizing condiment packets, his hands moving in steady patterns while he considered his response. "I've spent time around bases before, Master Sergeant. Different circumstances, but the basic operations remain consistent." The careful phrasing intrigued Patterson further. Different circumstances could mean many things, but the way Marcus said it suggested significant experience rather than casual exposure. His instincts, honed by 22 years of military service, detected layers beneath the surface that warranted closer attention. "Well, if you need anything or run into problems with personnel giving you trouble, you know where to find me," Patterson said before moving away. Marcus nodded his acknowledgement and returned to his tasks, but the brief interaction had not gone unnoticed by other cafeteria occupants. Several conversations had paused during the exchange, and resuming discussions carried a slightly different tone regarding the civilian contractor's presence. Shen looked confused by what he'd witnessed. Why is the Master Sergeant treating him like regular personnel? Guys just hired help cleaning tables. Watson's earlier suspicions strengthened as he processed the interaction. Did you hear how he addressed Patterson? That wasn't civilian politeness. That was military courtesy from someone who knows the system. Martinez remained skeptical, but admitted the exchange had been unusual. Maybe he's prior service after all. But if that's true, why is he working maintenance instead of using his veteran benefits for something better? The questions hung in the air without answers as Marcus completed his work in the cafeteria. His cart squeaked slightly as he maneuvered between tables, the sound mixing with renewed conversations that now included speculation about his background. The pattern of dismissal remained intact, but small cracks of curiosity had begun to appear in the solid wall of assumptions surrounding his presence on base. The morning briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as personnel prepared for the arrival of Colonel Helena Reeves. Her unannounced inspection had sent ripples of anxiety throughout Fort Brennan's command structure, and every detail from floor polish to paperwork alignment had received frantic attention since dawn. Marcus worked methodically in the adjacent hallway, his vacuum cleaner's motor providing a steady background hum, while officers hurried past him with barely concealed stress. Major Thompson emerged from a briefing room, his uniform bearing the crisp perfection that only came from multiple inspections under fluorescent lighting. He spotted Marcus and immediately approached, his expression mixing authority with impatience. "You need to be finished here before 0800, Thompson told Marcus sharply. "We have a high-ranking visitor arriving, and this entire corridor needs to be cleared of maintenance personnel." Marcus switched off the vacuum and looked up at the major. "Yes, sir. I can complete this section and move to Building C if that works better for your timeline." Thompson's eyebrows raised slightly at the respectful response, but his focus remained on the approaching inspection. "Just make sure you're invisible when the colonel arrives. She has very specific standards about base appearance and operations." As Thompson hurried away, Marcus resumed his work with increased efficiency. His movements carried an unconscious precision that spoke of muscle memory developed through years of responding to sudden changes in operational tempo. The vacuum's cord wrapped around his arm in practiced loops that suggested familiarity with equipment management under time pressure. 20 minutes later, the distinctive sound of a staff car's engine echoed through the corridor. Marcus had finished his assigned section and was preparing to move his equipment when the main entrance doors opened with military precision. Colonel Helena Reeves entered the building followed by her aide and two senior non-commissioned officers, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every person within sight. Reeves moved through the corridor with the confident stride of someone accustomed to instant respect and immediate compliance. Her uniform displayed the ribbons and insignia of extensive combat experience, and her bearing suggested a career built on competence rather than politics. She paused near the briefing room entrance, her eyes scanning the hallway with the thoroughness of someone trained to notice details others missed. Marcus had positioned himself near the wall with his equipment, attempting to minimize his presence while the colonel conducted her initial assessment. His stillness and professional positioning caught Reeves's attention more than movement might have, and she studied him with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel. Major Thompson appeared at her elbow, ready to begin the formal briefing process. "Colonel, if you're ready, we have the facility overview prepared along with current operational status reports." Reeves nodded, but continued her examination of the corridor and its occupants. Her gaze lingered on Marcus, taking in his civilian clothes, his professional positioning, and the way he stood at attention without appearing to do so consciously. "Who's the maintenance contractor?" she asked Thompson directly. Thompson glanced at Marcus with mild irritation, as if his presence was a detail he'd hoped would go unnoticed. "Pinnacle Facility Services personnel, ma'am. They handle routine cleaning and maintenance throughout the administrative complex." Reeves walked closer to Marcus, her approach causing Thompson visible anxiety about protocol and timing. Her examination was thorough, but not hostile, carrying the professional assessment of someone trained to read people quickly and accurately. "Good morning," she said to Marcus directly, her tone neither friendly nor dismissive, but simply acknowledging his presence as worthy of direct communication. "Good morning, Colonel," Marcus replied, his posture unconsciously straightening further while maintaining the respectful distance appropriate for a civilian contractor addressing senior military authority. The response surprised both Reeves and Thompson. Most civilian contractors either avoided eye contact with high-ranking officers or responded with awkward familiarity that betrayed their unfamiliarity with military etiquette. Marcus's response carried the automatic precision of someone comfortable with military hierarchies. "You seem familiar with military protocol," Reeves observed, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "I've worked around military installations before, ma'am," Marcus replied carefully. "Different capacities, but the basic courtesies remain consistent." Thompson shifted impatiently beside them, clearly eager to move the colonel away from what he considered an unnecessary interaction with support personnel. The briefing materials were prepared and waiting, and every minute spent in corridor conversation was a minute that could complicate his carefully planned schedule. Reeves seemed unaware of Thompson's discomfort as she continued her assessment of Marcus. Something about his bearing and responses had triggered her professional curiosity, and decades of military experience had taught her to trust such instincts when evaluating personnel. What kind of different capacities, she asked, her question direct, but not interrogational. Various contract work on military installations over the years, Colonel. Nothing as structured as this current assignment, but enough exposure to understand protocol expectations. The answer was truthful while revealing nothing specific, a balance that impressed Reeves with its diplomatic precision. In her experience, people who could navigate such conversational territory possessed skills that went beyond their current job descriptions. Thompson finally intervened, his voice carrying barely concealed urgency. "Colonel, we have a full schedule plan for your inspection. The briefing room is prepared and the staff is assembled for your convenience." Reeves took one final look at Marcus before nodding to Thompson. "Of course, Major. Lead the way." As the colonel's party moved toward the briefing room, Marcus resumed organizing his equipment for relocation to Building C. But the encounter had not gone unnoticed by other personnel in the corridor, and several conversations began among the officers and enlisted personnel who had witnessed the exchange. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had observed the interaction from the reception desk, turned to her colleague with obvious confusion. "Did the colonel just have a conversation with the maintenance guy? That was weird, right?" Her companion, Sergeant Shun, nodded while shuffling through paperwork. "Definitely weird. Most officers pretend contractors are invisible unless something's broken or needs fixing." The brief interaction had created ripples of curiosity throughout the immediate area, with personnel beginning to reconsider their assumptions about the civilian contractor who had somehow earned direct acknowledgement from a visiting colonel. The questions multiplied quietly among the staff, though none dared voice them loudly enough to reach the briefing room, where more pressing military matters demanded attention. Marcus completed his equipment organization and began moving toward the exit, but the morning's encounter had shifted something fundamental in the base's social dynamics. The pattern of complete dismissal had been broken by genuine military curiosity, creating possibilities that hadn't existed just minutes before. The supply closet in Building C contained enough industrial cleaning equipment to service a small city. But Marcus navigated the cramped space with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making the most of limited resources. His hands moved automatically as he inventoried chemical supplies. But Sergeant First Class Williams watched from the doorway with growing fascination at the contractor's systematic approach. "You've done this kind of work before," Williams observed, noting how Marcus organized supplies according to usage frequency rather than alphabetical order. "Most new hires take weeks to figure out efficient storage systems." Marcus continued his inventory without looking up, his voice carrying the neutral professionalism he'd maintained throughout his employment. "Experience teaches you to work smarter rather than harder, Sergeant. Saves time and reduces waste." Williams stepped closer, intrigued by the methodical precision of Marcus's movements. Each bottle and container found its designated position with military efficiency that seemed almost unconscious. The way he handled hazardous materials suggested training that went beyond basic safety orientation. "Where'd you pick up inventory management skills like that?" Williams asked, his curiosity overriding normal boundaries between military personnel and civilian contractors. "Various jobs over the years," Marcus replied, lifting a case of floor cleaner with technique that protected his back while maximizing leverage. "You learn to adapt systems to circumstances when you move between different work environments." The evasive answer only heightened Williams's interest. He'd supervised enough contract workers to recognize the difference between learned competence and natural ability. Marcus's movements carried the automatic precision of someone whose training had been comprehensive and intensive. 20 feet away, Private Hassan struggled with a similar inventory task in the adjacent storage room. His clipboard fell twice as he attempted to balance counting supplies with recording numbers, and his frustrated sighs carried clearly through the thin walls separating the spaces. "Need some help over there," Williams called to Hassan, but his attention remained focused on Marcus's continued efficiency. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Hassan replied, though the sound of dropping boxes suggested otherwise. "Just try to get these numbers to match the requisition forms." Marcus paused in his own work and glanced toward the adjacent room, where Hassan's struggles continued. His expression showed the particular patience of someone who had witnessed similar difficulties countless times before. Supply discrepancies usually come from counting open containers as full units, Marcus said quietly to Williams. "Most inventory systems don't account for partial usage when calculating totals." Williams raised his eyebrows at the observation. "That's exactly Hassan's problem. How do you know that without looking at his paperwork?" "Common issue in most supply chains," Marcus replied, resuming his organization of cleaning chemicals. "Math works the same way regardless of what you're counting." The simple statement carried implications that Williams couldn't quite grasp, but found oddly impressive. He'd spent 3 years managing supply operations and still occasionally struggled with inventory reconciliation. Yet this civilian contractor had identified Hassan's specific problem from ambient noise alone. Hassan appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression showing the frustration of someone fighting losing battles with bureaucratic systems. His clipboard bore the evidence of multiple erasures and corrections that suggested mathematical difficulties. "Sergeant Williams, I can't get these numbers to balance," Hassan admitted reluctantly. "Either we're missing supplies or the requisition forms are wrong." Marcus looked up from his work, his gaze taking in Hassan's clipboard with the quick assessment of someone trained to process information rapidly. His eyes moved across the columns of numbers with practiced efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with similar documents. "Try separating your open containers from sealed inventory," Marcus suggested quietly. "Count partial units as fractional values rather than whole numbers." Hassan looked confused by the suggestion, but Williams nodded with sudden understanding. The civilian contractor had identified the exact source of the inventory discrepancy that had been plaguing their supply operations for weeks. "How'd you figure that out so fast?" Hassan asked Marcus directly, his tone mixing gratitude with genuine curiosity about the contractor's unexpected competence. "Numbers tell stories when you know how to read them," Marcus replied, returning to his own tasks. "Pattern recognition becomes automatic after you've seen enough similar problems." Williams exchanged glances with Hassan, both recognizing that Marcus's casual expertise suggested background knowledge that went far beyond routine maintenance work. The way he approached problems carried the systematic thinking of someone with extensive training in complex operations. "You ever work in logistics or supply chain management?" Williams asked directly, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "Various capacities over the years," Marcus replied, his standard evasive response delivered with the same neutral professionalism he maintained in all such interactions. The non-answer frustrated Williams, but something about Marcus's demeanor discouraged further probing. There was a quality of quiet authority in his responses that suggested boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, even by military personnel accustomed to getting direct answers from civilian contractors. Hassan implemented Marcus's suggestion and found his inventory numbers balancing perfectly within minutes. His relief was obvious as he completed his paperwork with newfound confidence in the mathematical accuracy of his results. "That actually worked perfectly," Hassan announced, his voice carrying surprise and gratitude. "Thanks for the help." Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but didn't look up from organizing cleaning supplies. His movements continued with the same methodical precision that had characterized his work since arriving at Fort Brennan, giving no indication that solving Hassan's problem had required any special effort or knowledge. Williams remained in the doorway, studying Marcus with renewed interest. The morning's events had revealed competencies that didn't match the assumptions most personnel had made about the civilian contractor's background and capabilities. "You know, if you ever get tired of maintenance work," Williams said carefully, "I could probably recommend you for supply chain positions that pay better and use more of your apparent skills. Marcus finally looked up, meeting Williams's gaze with expression that was grateful but firm. "I appreciate the offer, Sergeant, but I'm content with my current assignment." Sometimes simple work provides exactly what someone needs. The response carried finality that discouraged further discussion, but Williams couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered someone whose true capabilities remained completely hidden beneath the surface of routine maintenance duties. The morning had revealed glimpses of competence that suggested stories worth knowing, even if those stories would never be voluntarily shared. The security checkpoint at the entrance to the classified wing buzzed with tension as Marcus approached with his cleaning cart. Corporal Davis stood behind the metal detector, his hand resting on his sidearm, while he studied the civilian contractor with obvious suspicion. The morning's shift change had brought increased scrutiny to all base operations, and civilian personnel were receiving particular attention. "Hold up there. Maintenance," Davis called out sharply, his voice carrying the authority of someone determined to demonstrate thoroughness. "I need to see your clearance documentation and perform a complete equipment search." Marcus stopped his cart and reached into his shirt pocket, producing the laminated badge that authorized his presence in restricted areas. His movements were deliberate and visible, demonstrating the automatic compliance of someone familiar with security protocols. Davis examined the badge with exaggerated care, comparing the photograph to Marcus's face while checking expiration dates and authorization codes. His scrutiny lasted far longer than necessary, creating an uncomfortable pause that drew attention from other personnel moving through the checkpoint. "This clearance is only 2 days old," Davis observed suspiciously. "How do we know you're not some kind of security risk trying to access sensitive areas?" The badge was issued through proper channels after complete background verification, Marcus replied calmly. "Base operations can confirm the authorization process if you have concerns." Davis's partner, Specialist Morrison, emerged from the guard station with a handheld metal detector and began examining Marcus's cleaning supplies with theatrical thoroughness. Each bottle and tool received individual attention, as if industrial cleaning equipment might conceal sophisticated surveillance devices. "We've had reports about suspicious civilian activity in restricted areas," Morrison announced loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear. "Can't be too careful about who we let wander around classified facilities." The statement was clearly designed to create doubt about Marcus's legitimacy, and several officers paused in their passage through the checkpoint to observe the extended security screening. Their expressions showed the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that came with witnessing unusual security procedures. Captain Webb appeared at Marcus's elbow, his presence adding official weight to the guard's scrutiny. His expression carried the satisfaction of someone whose earlier concerns were being validated through proper security protocols. "Gentlemen, I'm glad to see you're taking contractor screening seriously," Webb said to the guards while studying Marcus with obvious skepticism. "We can't assume that employment verification equals security clearance for sensitive operations." Marcus remained silent during the exchange, his posture maintaining the respectful attention appropriate for civilian personnel under military scrutiny. But something in his stillness suggested patience honed through experience with far more serious interrogations than this security theater. Davis completed his examination of the cleaning supplies and turned his attention to Marcus personally. "I need you to empty your pockets completely and submit to a full search before entering this wing." The demand exceeded normal security procedures for cleared contractors, and several observing personnel recognized the unusual nature of the request. But Marcus complied without protest, placing his wallet, keys, and a small folding knife on the inspection table. Morrison seized on the knife immediately, holding it up for everyone to see. "Unauthorized blade on a civilian contractor," he announced. "This could be considered a security violation requiring detention and investigation." "It's a standard utility knife, sir," Marcus replied quietly. "Required equipment for opening packaging and removing adhesive materials during cleaning operations." Webb stepped closer to examine the knife, his expression showing triumph at discovering what he considered evidence of poor security screening. "This blade exceeds regulation length for civilian personnel in restricted areas. I think we need to involve base security for a complete investigation. The knife was a simple folding utility blade, identical to tools carried by maintenance personnel throughout the military, but Webb's tone suggested discovery of a concealed weapon. His voice carried clearly to the growing audience of personnel who had stopped to watch the proceedings. Master Sergeant Patterson approached the checkpoint from the secured side, his expression showing concern about the delay and commotion. His eyes took in the scene quickly, assessing the players and their motivations with the experience of someone familiar with both security requirements and security theater. "What's the holdup here?" Patterson asked Davis directly, his tone carrying the authority of senior enlisted leadership. "Sir, we discovered unauthorized equipment on this civilian contractor," Davis replied, gesturing toward the utility knife. "Captain Webb believes it constitutes a security violation requiring investigation." Patterson examined the knife briefly, then looked at Webb with barely concealed irritation. "Captain, this is standard maintenance equipment. Every contractor on base carries identical tools for their assigned duties." Webb's confidence wavered slightly under Patterson's scrutiny, but he maintained his position. "Master Sergeant, we can't be too careful about civilian access to restricted areas. This man's background remains questionable despite his employment verification." Marcus watched the exchange without speaking, but his attention focused on Patterson with the recognition of someone identifying genuine military leadership amid the posturing and bureaucratic maneuvering. His expression showed respect for Patterson's intervention without revealing relief at the support. The crowd of observing personnel had grown larger, with conversations beginning about the unusual security screening and its implications. Several officers whispered among themselves about the appropriateness of Webb's demands and the guard's excessive scrutiny of routine contractor operations. Patterson's voice cut through the murmuring with command authority that immediately focused everyone's attention. "This contractor has proper clearance and standard equipment. Unless someone has specific intelligence about security threats, we're creating delays that interfere with mission operations." Webb's face reddened at the public correction, but his authority was insufficient to challenge Patterson directly. The Master Sergeant's intervention had effectively ended the security theater, though Webb's expression promised future difficulties for Marcus. Davis reluctantly returned Marcus's belongings and waved him through the checkpoint, his disappointment obvious at losing the opportunity to demonstrate security vigilance. Morrison stepped aside with equal reluctance, their hopes of discovering significant security violations thoroughly frustrated. As Marcus resumed, pushing his cart toward the classified wing, conversations resumed among the observing personnel. The incident had created more questions about the civilian contractor's background, while revealing the various agendas and insecurities of different military personnel. The security checkpoint incident marked an escalation in the scrutiny Marcus faced, but it had also revealed allies like Patterson who recognized competence and professionalism regardless of uniform status. The battle lines were becoming clearer as his presence continued to challenge assumptions and expose character throughout the base community. The alarm system's piercing wail cut through the afternoon quiet of Fort Brennan like a blade, sending personnel scrambling toward designated assembly points with practiced urgency. Marcus had been replacing light fixtures in the communications center when the emergency signal began, and he immediately ceased his work to clear the area as protocol demanded. "All personnel report to primary assembly area immediately." The base announcement system crackled with authority. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All personnel report for emergency accountability formation." Marcus pushed his equipment cart to the side of the corridor and began moving toward the exit, but Lieutenant Torres intercepted him near the main doors. The young officer's face showed the stress of someone suddenly responsible for ensuring complete personnel accountability during an unexpected emergency. "Hold it right there," Torres commanded, blocking Marcus's path with outstretched arms. "Where exactly do you think you're going during a base-wide emergency?" "To the assembly area as directed, sir," Marcus replied calmly. "Protocol requires all personnel to report for accountability formation during emergency situations." Torres's expression showed confusion mixed with authority as he processed the contractor's response. His training had covered accountability procedures for military personnel, but civilian contractors represented a gray area that his emergency protocols hadn't adequately addressed. "You're not military personnel," Torres said uncertainly. "I'm not sure contractors are included in emergency accountability requirements. Emergency protocols include all personnel present on base during incidents," Marcus replied with quiet confidence. "Civilian contractors are subject to the same safety and security procedures as military staff during crisis situations." The assertion surprised Torres, who had assumed civilian personnel would be evacuated separately or excluded from military emergency procedures. Marcus's familiarity with emergency protocols suggested experience that went beyond routine safety briefings for contract workers. "How do you know so much about military emergency procedures?" Torres asked suspiciously, his voice carrying the skepticism that had characterized most interactions between base personnel and the civilian contractor. "Standard safety training for anyone working on military installations," Marcus replied, his tone remaining neutral despite the obvious challenge in Torres's question. "Emergency procedures are consistent across most facilities." Torres remained uncertain about proper protocol, but the continuing alarm system reminded him that delays could compromise the entire accountability process. Other personnel streamed past them toward the assembly area, their urgency highlighting the importance of rapid compliance with emergency procedures. "Fine, but you stay with me during the formation," Torres decided. "I need to keep track of all civilian personnel in my area of responsibility." "Understood, sir," Marcus agreed, falling into step beside the lieutenant as they moved toward the primary assembly point. The assembly area buzzed with controlled chaos as hundreds of personnel formed into unit formations according to emergency procedures. Squad leaders called roll, while officers moved between groups, ensuring complete accountability for their assigned personnel. The organized confusion of a major emergency exercise played out with the precision that came from regular training and clear command structures. Colonel Reeves appeared at the center of the formation, her presence commanding immediate attention from all personnel present. Her aide carried a comprehensive roster that would account for every person authorized to be on base during the emergency, and the accountability process would continue until every name had been verified. Marcus found himself standing slightly apart from the main formation, his civilian clothes marking him as distinctly separate from the uniformed personnel surrounding him. Torres remained nearby, clearly uncertain about proper procedures for managing contractor accountability during emergency situations. Sergeant Major Hayes approached their position, his experienced eye taking in the situation quickly. His decades of military service had taught him to identify unusual circumstances that required command attention, and a civilian contractor standing in the middle of an emergency formation definitely qualified as unusual. "Lieutenant, what's the status of civilian personnel accountability?" Hayes asked Torres directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate and accurate answers. "Sir, I have one contractor from Pinnacle Facility Services present during the emergency," Torres replied, gesturing toward Marcus. "I wasn't certain about proper procedures for civilian accountability during base-wide alerts." Hayes studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone trained to assess personnel quickly and accurately. His attention focused on Marcus's posture and bearing, noting details that suggested familiarity with military emergency procedures that went beyond basic safety orientation. "What's your name and assignment?" Hayes asked Marcus directly, his tone professional but commanding immediate compliance. "Marcus Castellano, Sergeant Major. Pinnacle Facility Services, assigned to administrative and communications building maintenance." Hayes nodded and made notes on his accountability roster, but his attention remained focused on Marcus's demeanor during the emergency situation. Most civilian contractors showed stress or confusion during military emergency procedures, but Marcus displayed the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "You seem comfortable with emergency formations," Hayes observed, his statement inviting explanation while not demanding it. Emergency procedures are similar across most installations, Sergeant Major, Marcus replied. Basic safety protocols remain consistent regardless of specific circumstances. The diplomatic answer revealed nothing while demonstrating familiarity with military communication patterns that impressed Hayes despite its evasiveness. He'd encountered many civilian contractors over his career, but few demonstrated such natural comfort with military emergency procedures. Colonel Reeves's voice cut across the assembly area with command authority that immediately focused everyone's attention. All unit leaders report accountability status. We need complete personnel verification before securing from emergency stations. Hayes turned his attention to the broader accountability process, but he made mental notes about the civilian contractor whose responses and bearings suggested experience that merited further investigation. The emergency had created an opportunity to observe Marcus under pressure, and the results were intriguing rather than concerning. Torres completed his accountability report and prepared to escort Marcus back to the communications building once the all-clear signal sounded. But the emergency formation had provided another data point in the growing collection of observations about the civilian contractor's background and capabilities. As personnel waited for the security all-clear, conversations began among various groups about the emergency procedures and their effectiveness. Several officers noted the presence of civilian contractors in the accountability formation, with mixed opinions about the appropriateness of including non-military personnel in emergency protocols. The emergency had created another opportunity for Marcus to demonstrate competence and familiarity with military procedures, while also exposing him to increased scrutiny from senior leadership who were beginning to notice patterns in his behavior that suggested hidden depths of experience and training. The post-emergency briefing room filled with tension as Colonel Reeves addressed the assembled staff about accountability procedures and security protocols. Marcus had hoped to slip away unnoticed after the all-clear signal, but Sergeant Major Hayes had specifically requested his presence for what was described as routine contractor debriefing following emergency operations. During today's exercise, we identified several areas requiring improved coordination between military and civilian personnel, Colonel Reeves announced to the gathered officers. Emergency accountability must include all individuals present on base regardless of employment status. Marcus sat in the back row of folding chairs, his civilian clothes creating a stark contrast against the sea of military uniforms surrounding him. His presence had drawn curious glances from personnel who rarely interacted with contractors during formal briefings, and whispered conversations speculated about his inclusion in leadership discussions. Captain Webb raised his hand from the front row, his expression showing the skepticism that had characterized his previous interactions with Marcus. Colonel, do we have sufficient background verification procedures for civilian contractors who might be present during classified emergency situations? The question was clearly directed at Marcus despite being phrased as general policy inquiry. Webb's tone carried implications about security risks and inadequate screening procedures that made several officers turn to study the civilian contractor with renewed interest. All contractors undergo comprehensive background investigations before receiving base access, Hayes replied firmly. Pinnacle Facility Services maintains current security clearances for personnel assigned to restricted areas. Webb persisted despite the sergeant major's response. I'm concerned about contractors who demonstrate unusual familiarity with military procedures. Perhaps we should implement additional screening for individuals whose backgrounds remain unclear. Marcus felt the weight of attention focusing on him as Webb's comments created doubt about his legitimacy and motivations. The captain's persistent challenges were designed to force disclosure of information that Marcus preferred to keep private, and the public setting amplified the pressure. Major Thompson spoke up from his position near the colonel's table. I've observed this particular contractor over several days, and his conduct has been consistently professional. He demonstrates competence without creating security concerns. Thompson's support surprised Marcus, who had expected continued suspicion from the major following their earlier interactions. But the defense also highlighted the growing division among base personnel regarding his presence and qualifications. Lieutenant Torres shifted uncomfortably in his seat before addressing the room. During today's emergency, the contractor displayed extensive knowledge of accountability procedures. His responses suggested training that goes beyond standard safety orientation. The observation was meant to be neutral, but it added weight to Webb's implications about Marcus's mysterious background. Every comment seemed to deepen the questions surrounding his experience and qualifications for routine maintenance work. Colonel Reeves had remained silent during the exchange, but her attention focused intensely on Marcus as the discussion continued. I noted his calm demeanor under scrutiny, recognizing the controlled composure of someone accustomed to withstanding pressure and maintaining operational security. Master Sergeant Patterson entered the briefing room late, taking a position near the door where he could observe the proceedings. His presence added another layer of complexity to the discussion, as personnel recognized his earlier support for the civilian contractor during security checkpoint difficulties. We seem to have conflicting assessments about this individual's background and qualifications, Colonel Reeves observed finally, her voice cutting through the various conversations. Perhaps we should address these concerns directly rather than speculating about civilian contractor procedures. The colonel's statement created immediate silence in the briefing room as all attention focused on Marcus. He found himself at the center of official scrutiny that could no longer be avoided through evasive responses and professional neutrality. Marcus Castellano, Colonel Reeves said directly, addressing him by name for the first time since their corridor encounter. Your colleagues have raised questions about your familiarity with military procedures and emergency protocols. Would you care to clarify your background for the benefit of this discussion? The direct question from the colonel created a moment of absolute quiet in the briefing room. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, though the exact nature of that significance remained unclear. Marcus felt the pressure of dozens of eyes focused on him, waiting for responses that could resolve the growing speculation about his identity. I've worked around military installations in various capacities over the years, Colonel, Marcus replied carefully. Different assignments have provided exposure to standard procedures and protocols. The response maintained his pattern of truthful evasion. But Colonel Reeves's expression indicated she found the answer insufficient given the level of competence he had demonstrated. Her military experience had taught her to recognize when personnel were concealing relevant information. Various capacities is quite general, Mr. Castellano, the colonel observed. Given the concerns raised by my staff, perhaps you could be more specific about your previous experience with military operations. Marcus felt the walls closing around his carefully maintained privacy, as the colonel's question demanded disclosure he had hoped to avoid. The roomful of military personnel waited for his response, their curiosity mixed with suspicion about his reluctance to provide straightforward answers about his background. Captain Webb leaned forward in his chair, sensing victory in his campaign to expose what he considered security vulnerabilities in contractor screening procedures. His expression showed satisfaction at forcing the civilian contractor into a position where evasion was no longer possible. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Marcus weighed his options for responding to direct questioning from a colonel in front of assembled base leadership. His decades of experience had taught him when battles could be avoided and when they had to be fought, and this moment was rapidly approaching the point where avoidance was no longer feasible. Colonel Reeves maintained her steady gaze on Marcus, her patience demonstrating the confidence of someone accustomed to getting answers when she demanded them. The briefing room remained absolutely quiet, as everyone present recognized they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the ongoing mystery surrounding the civilian contractor's true identity and qualifications. The briefing room atmosphere grew thicker as Colonel Reeves waited for Marcus's response to her direct question about his military background. Every second of silence amplified the tension, with personnel shifting in their seats as they witnessed what appeared to be a security interrogation disguised as routine contractor debriefing. Mr. Castellano, the colonel repeated with increased firmness, I'm waiting for a specific answer about your previous military experience. Your evasiveness is becoming a concern in itself. Marcus felt the full weight of command authority bearing down on him as dozens of eyes remained fixed on his position in the back row. His carefully maintained anonymity was crumbling under official scrutiny that could no longer be deflected through diplomatic responses. I've had various contractor positions supporting military operations, Colonel, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. Different time frames and locations, but all in support capacities rather than direct military service. The answer was technically truthful while revealing nothing substantial, but Colonel Reeves's expression indicated her patience with evasive responses was rapidly diminishing. Her experience with personnel interviews had taught her to recognize when someone was concealing significant information. Captain Webb seized the moment to press his advantage in exposing what he considered security vulnerabilities. Colonel, I believe this individual's reluctance to provide straightforward answers about his background constitutes a potential security risk requiring immediate investigation. Webb's accusation created murmurs throughout the briefing room as personnel began to view Marcus's privacy as suspicious rather than professional. The captain's persistence had successfully transformed reasonable discretion into apparent deception in the eyes of many observers. Sergeant Major Hayes stepped forward from his position near the wall, his intervention carrying the authority of senior, enlisted leadership. Sir, this contractor has demonstrated consistent professionalism and competence throughout his assignment. His work performance has exceeded expectations without creating any security incidents. Hayes's defense provided temporary relief from the mounting accusations, but it also highlighted the growing division among base personnel regarding Marcus's legitimacy and qualifications. The room was splitting into factions of supporters and skeptics based on their individual interactions with a civilian contractor. Major Thompson nodded in agreement with Hayes's assessment. I concur with the Sergeant Major's evaluation. Whatever this man's background, his conduct has been exemplary and his work quality superior to most contractors we've employed. But Lieutenant Torres raised his hand with obvious reluctance to contradict his superiors. Sir, while I agree about his professionalism, his knowledge of military procedures seems extensive for someone claiming only contractor experience. His responses during the emergency suggested training that goes beyond civilian orientation. Torres's observation added credibility to Webb's suspicions while maintaining professional courtesy toward Marcus. The lieutenant's reluctant testimony carried more weight than Webb's obvious hostility, making the concern seem more legitimate to neutral observers. Colonel Reeves studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone trained to read people under pressure. His controlled composure under intense scrutiny impressed her even as his evasiveness frustrated her need for straightforward answers about potential security concerns. Master Sergeant Patterson finally spoke from his position near the door, his voice carrying the gravity of extensive military experience. Colonel, I've worked with thousands of contractors over 22 years of service. This man's competence and bearing suggest significant military background, regardless of his current employment status. Patterson's assessment carried tremendous weight given his reputation and experience, but it also increased pressure on Marcus to explain the discrepancy between his claimed contractor-only background and his obvious military knowledge and bearing. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as personnel processed the conflicting assessments and tried to determine the truth about Marcus's qualifications and background. Some viewed his evasiveness as suspicious, while others saw it as understandable privacy preferences that didn't necessarily indicate deception. Colonel Reeves raised her hand for silence, her gesture immediately focusing all attention back to the central confrontation. Mr. Castellano, I'm going to ask you one final time for a direct answer. Have you ever served in the United States military in any capacity? The direct question eliminated any possibility of continued evasion through diplomatic language or technical truthfulness. Marcus felt the full force of command authority demanding disclosure that would fundamentally change his relationship with everyone present in the briefing room. Captain Webb leaned forward with obvious anticipation of vindication for his persistent suspicions about the civilian contractor's background and motivations. His expression showed confidence that Marcus would finally be exposed as either a security risk or someone who had misrepresented his qualifications. The silence stretched unbearably as Marcus weighed his options for responding to a direct question from a colonel in front of assembled base leadership. His decades of training in operational security warred with his respect for legitimate military authority and the growing impossibility of maintaining his anonymity. Lieutenant Torres watched the confrontation with fascination, mixed with concern about the implications of whatever revelation was approaching. His earlier observations had contributed to the pressure now bearing down on the civilian contractor, and he wondered if he had inadvertently triggered something beyond his understanding. Sergeant Major Hayes maintained his supportive position, but recognized that Marcus was approaching a decision point where external pressure would force disclosure regardless of personal preferences. The veteran non-commissioned officer's experience told him they were about to learn something significant about the quiet civilian contractor. Colonel Reeves's patience had reached its limit as she prepared to demand a final answer that would either resolve the questions surrounding Marcus Castellano or trigger formal security investigation procedures. The briefing room remained absolutely silent, as everyone present recognized they were witnessing a moment that would fundamentally alter the base's understanding of the man they had dismissed as routine maintenance personnel. Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at Colonel Reeves, knowing his next words would change everything about his carefully maintained anonymity and the assumptions everyone had made about his background and qualifications. Marcus met Colonel Reeves's unwavering gaze across the silent briefing room, feeling the weight of 37 pairs of eyes focused on his response to her direct question about military service. The moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, with everyone present sensing they stood at the threshold of a significant revelation. "Yes, Colonel," Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying across the absolute silence of the room. "I serve in the United States military." The admission created an immediate stir among the assembled personnel as conversations erupted in whispers and murmurs. Captain Webb's expression showed vindication mixed with frustration that his suspicions had been confirmed, while supporters like Master Sergeant Patterson nodded with the satisfaction of having their instinct validated. Colonel Reeves leaned forward slightly, her attention intensely focused on Marcus as she pressed for additional details. "What branch of service, Mr. Castellano, and what was your final rank upon separation?" "Army, ma'am," Marcus replied, maintaining eye contact despite the obvious discomfort of disclosure. "I separated as a staff sergeant after completing my enlistment obligations." The answer provided basic information while revealing nothing about the nature of his service or the circumstances surrounding his separation from military duty. Several officers exchanged glances, recognizing that Marcus was continuing to provide minimal disclosure despite direct questioning from a colonel. Sergeant Major Hayes stepped closer to Marcus's position, his expression showing professional curiosity about a fellow veteran's background and experience. "What was your military occupational specialty, Staff Sergeant Castellano?" The use of his former rank created another ripple of reaction throughout the briefing room as personnel processed the transformation of their assumptions about the civilian contractor's background and qualifications. Marcus was no longer just a maintenance worker, but a former military professional whose experience suddenly explained his competence and bearing. "Multiple specialties over the course of my service, Sergeant Major," Marcus replied carefully. "I cross-trained in several areas depending on unit requirements and mission needs." The diplomatic response maintained his pattern of truthful evasion while avoiding specific details that might trigger recognition or additional scrutiny. But Colonel Reeves's expression indicated she was far from satisfied with the level of disclosure he was providing. Major Thompson raised his hand to address the colonel directly. "Ma'am, should we be conducting this interview in a more secure environment given the potential classification levels involved in discussing military specialties and unit assignments?" Thompson's suggestion created immediate tension in the briefing room, as personnel realized they might be witnessing disclosure of information that required security precautions. The implication that Marcus's service might have involved classified operations added new dimensions to the mystery surrounding his background. Colonel Reeves considered Thompson's recommendation while studying Marcus's reaction to the suggestion of moving to a secure facility. His expression remained neutral, but she detected subtle signs of increased stress at the prospect of formal interrogation procedures. "That may be advisable, Major," the colonel agreed after a moment's consideration. "Mr. Castellano, I'm going to ask you to accompany me to a secure briefing facility where we can continue this discussion with appropriate classification protections." The formal request carried the implicit authority of command, and Marcus recognized he had reached the point where cooperation was no longer optional. His carefully maintained privacy was dissolving under official scrutiny that would inevitably reveal details he had hoped to keep buried in his past. Lieutenant Torres watched the proceedings with fascination mixed with concern about his role in triggering what appeared to be a security investigation. His earlier observations about Marcus's unusual competence had contributed to the chain of events now forcing disclosure of potentially classified information. Captain Webb's satisfaction at having his suspicions validated was tempered by the realization that he might have stumbled into matters beyond his security clearance level. The prospect of classified discussions about Marcus's background suggested complexities that exceeded routine contractor screening concerns. As personnel began filing out of the briefing room in preparation for the secure facility transfer, conversations buzzed with speculation about the civilian contractor's true background and the implications of his military service. The revelation had answered some questions while creating many more about his qualifications and experience. Sergeant Major Hayes approached Marcus as the room emptied, his expression showing professional respect for a fellow veteran despite the unusual circumstances. "Staff Sergeant, whatever your background, you've conducted yourself with honor during your time here." "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Marcus replied, grateful for the support from someone who understood military service and the complexities that could surround post-service employment situations. Master Sergeant Patterson joined them near the exit, adding his voice to Hayes' support. "We look forward to learning more about your service, Staff Sergeant. Your competence and bearing have impressed everyone who's worked with you." The encouragement from senior enlisted leadership provided some comfort as Marcus prepared to face more intensive questioning about his military background and the circumstances that had led him to maintenance work at Fort Brennan. But he also recognized that the revelation of his veteran status was only the beginning of disclosures he would be forced to make. Colonel Reeves waited near the door as the briefing room cleared, her attention focused on Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone preparing for a significant interview. Her experience with personnel investigations had taught her to recognize when initial admissions were merely the surface of much deeper stories. The transfer to a secure facility would provide classification protection for whatever details emerged about Marcus's military service, but would also eliminate his ability to control the pace and extent of disclosure through evasive responses and diplomatic language. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Marcus took one final look at the space where his anonymity had finally been shattered. The revelation of his veteran status had fundamentally changed his relationship with base personnel, but it had also opened the door to questions about service details he was not yet prepared to answer. The walk to the secure facility would provide a few final minutes to prepare for interrogation that would inevitably reveal the full truth about his military background and the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his post-service life. The moment of complete disclosure was rapidly approaching, whether he was ready for it or not. The secure conference room in Building Alpha felt like a different world from the open briefing facility they had just left. Soundproof walls, encrypted communication equipment, and classification warnings created an atmosphere of serious intelligence operations that made Marcus's maintenance worker cover seem increasingly inadequate for the scrutiny he was about to face. Colonel Reeves settled into her chair across the polished conference table from Marcus, her aide positioning a digital recorder and classification logs with practiced efficiency. Sergeant Major Hayes and Master Sergeant Patterson flanked the table, their presence lending weight to what was clearly becoming a formal investigation rather than routine contractor debriefing. This conversation is classified secret pending determination of actual classification levels, Colonel Reeves announced formally. All personnel present hold appropriate clearances for this initial assessment. Marcus nodded his understanding, recognizing the protocols from his own military experience, even as they were now being applied to investigate his background rather than protect his operations. The irony of the situation was not lost on him, as he prepared to become the subject rather than the protector of classified information. Staff Sergeant Castellano, I need you to provide specific details about your military service, including units, deployments, and any special operations experience that might explain your exceptional competence in areas beyond typical enlisted specialties. The colonel's question was direct and comprehensive, eliminating any possibility of continued evasion through partial disclosure. Marcus felt the familiar weight of operational security requirements warring with his respect for legitimate command authority and the impossibility of maintaining his cover story. Colonel, my service record includes deployments to classified locations in support of special operations units. Marcus replied carefully. The specific details require verification of need to know before I can provide comprehensive information. The response impressed everyone present with its professional handling of classification requirements, but it also confirmed their suspicions that Marcus's background involved operations far beyond routine military service. His familiarity with security protocols suggested experience with highly classified missions. Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest in learning more about a fellow veteran's specialized background. What level of clearance did you hold during your active duty service, Staff Sergeant? Top secret with compartmentalized access, Marcus replied, his answer creating immediate recognition among the senior personnel present. The clearance level indicated involvement in operations that few military members ever experienced. Colonel Reeves's expression sharpened as she processed the implications of Marcus's security clearance history. Personnel with top-secret compartmentalized access were typically involved in the most sensitive military operations, making his current employment as a maintenance contractor increasingly puzzling. Patterson's voice carried new respect as he addressed Marcus directly. Staff Sergeant, compartmentalized access suggests special operations or intelligence work. Can you provide general information about your operational specialty without compromising classified details? Marcus hesitated before responding, recognizing that each answer was leading inevitably toward disclosure of information he had hoped to keep private. But the secure environment and legitimate need to know of senior military leadership made continued evasion increasingly untenable. I serve with units conducting direct action and special reconnaissance missions in multiple theaters, Colonel, Marcus said quietly. My specific role varied, depending on mission requirements and operational parameters. The admission created a moment of stunned silence as the implications became clear to everyone present. Direct action and special reconnaissance were the domains of elite military units whose members were legendary within the special operations community for their skills and dedication. Hayes whistled softly under his breath before catching himself in the formal environment. Staff Sergeant, that explains your competence and bearing. Your special operations qualified. The confirmation transformed the atmosphere in the secure conference room as senior personnel realized they had been witnessing not a maintenance contractor with unusual abilities, but a special operations veteran whose skills had been temporarily hidden beneath civilian employment. The revelation recontextualized every interaction they had observed. Colonel Reeves studied Marcus with renewed interest and growing respect for his background and capabilities. Her expression showed the particular recognition that came from understanding the significance of special operations service and the extraordinary individuals who comprise those elite units. Mr. Castellano, I need to ask about your separation from military service, the colonel said with increased formality. Were you medically retired? Did you complete your enlistment? Or were there other circumstances surrounding your transition to civilian employment? The question touched on the most sensitive aspect of Marcus's post-military life, and his expression showed the emotional weight of memories he preferred not to revisit. But the secure environment and direct questioning from a colonel made evasion impossible. I was medically separated following injuries sustained during classified operations, Colonel, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the strain of discussing painful personal history. The separation was honorable with full disability recognition. The revelation explained Marcus's transition from elite military service to civilian maintenance work, but it also raised new questions about the nature of his injuries and their impact on his capabilities. His current physical competence suggested recovery from whatever trauma had ended his military career. Patterson's expression showed understanding and sympathy for the challenges faced by wounded special operations veterans transitioning to civilian employment. Medical separation often marked the end of careers that had defined men's entire adult lives. Staff Sergeant, are you receiving appropriate veteran services and support for your transition and medical needs? Patterson asked with genuine concern for Marcus's welfare. I manage my situation adequately, Sergeant Major, Marcus replied, his tone indicating reluctance to discuss personal struggles with military medical and employment systems. Colonel Reeves recognized that they had reached the core of Marcus's story, but she also sensed there were still significant details about his service that had not been disclosed. Her experience with special operations personnel had taught her that their most significant achievements often remained classified long after their separation from service. Staff Sergeant Castellano, I have one final question that may help us understand your background completely, the colonel said with formal gravity. During your special operations service, did you operate under a specific call sign that your unit members would recognize? The question struck Marcus like a physical blow as he realized the colonel was approaching the one piece of information that would instantly identify him within the special operations community. His call sign represented not just his individual identity, but his legendary status among the warriors who had served alongside him in the most dangerous missions imaginable. The secure conference room fell absolutely silent as everyone present recognized they were approaching a revelation that would fundamentally change their understanding of the man they had known only as a civilian maintenance contractor. Marcus felt the weight of decades pressing down on him as he prepared to speak the words that would shatter his anonymity forever. The secure conference room held its breath as Colonel Reeves waited for Marcus's response to her question about his call sign. Every person present understood they were witnessing a moment that would either conclude their investigation or open doorways to revelations beyond their current comprehension. The weight of decades of classified service hung in the air between them. Marcus looked directly at Colonel Reeves, his expression showing the resignation of someone who had reached the end of his ability to maintain operational security through evasion. The careful anonymity he had constructed over months of civilian employment was about to be destroyed by two words that would instantly identify him within the special operations community. Hawk 8, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room, with the finality of a confession that could not be retracted. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Sergeant Major Hayes's face went completely white as recognition hit him like a physical blow. His chair scraped against the floor as he unconsciously pushed back from the table, his mouth opening in shock that rendered him temporarily speechless. Master Sergeant Patterson's reaction was equally dramatic but different in character. His eyes widened with something approaching awe as the legendary call sign connected with stories he had heard whispered in special operations circles for years. His hands gripped the edge of the conference table as he struggled to process the reality of who had been working among them. Colonel Reeves felt her own composure crack as the implications cascaded through her understanding of military history and special operations legend. Hawk 8 was not just a call sign, but a designation that carried mythical status among those familiar with classified operations in multiple theaters over nearly 2 decades. Jesus Christ, Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible in the stunned silence. You're the Hawk 8, the one from Operation Nightfall in Afghanistan. The 3-day siege at Firebase Charlie. Marcus remained silent, but his expression confirmed Hayes's recognition while revealing the emotional cost of having his most painful memories dragged into the light. The operations Hayes referenced represented some of the most classified and dangerous missions ever conducted by American Special Forces. Patterson found his voice with obvious effort, his tone carrying reverence mixed with disbelief. Staff Sergeant, you held that firebase for 72 hours against overwhelming odds. Intelligence estimates said you faced over 200 enemy combatants with a team of 12 men. The numbers were classified information that Patterson should not have possessed, but Special Operations legends had a way of spreading through unofficial channels despite security restrictions. Marcus's actions during that siege had become the stuff of whispered stories among warriors who understood impossible odds. Colonel Reeves struggled to maintain professional composure as she processed the magnitude of having Hawk 8 working maintenance duties at her installation. Her knowledge of classified operations was extensive, but even her security clearance had not provided access to all the details surrounding Marcus's legendary service record. The Medal of Honor citation, Hayes said slowly, pieces of memory falling into place. The one that was classified for operational security reasons. That was you, wasn't it? Marcus's slight nod confirmed what Hayes suspected, but the admission created another wave of shock among those present. A Medal of Honor recipient working as a civilian maintenance contractor represented a failure of veteran services that bordered on criminal negligence. Patterson's voice cracked with emotion as he addressed Marcus directly. Sir, you saved an entire Special Forces detachment and prevented classified intelligence from falling into enemy hands. Your actions changed the course of operations in that entire theater. The formal recognition from a senior non-commissioned officer carried weight that transcended rank structure and spoke to the respect that warriors held for genuine heroes. But Marcus's expression showed only pain at having his past achievements forced into the present conversation. Colonel Reeves finally found her voice, though it carried none of its earlier authority. Staff Sergeant Castellano, your service record includes some of the most classified and dangerous operations ever conducted. How did you end up working maintenance at Fort Brennan? The question touched on the systemic failures that had left a Medal of Honor recipient struggling with civilian employment while battling medical conditions resulting from his military service. Marcus's story represented the gap between military heroism and post-service support systems. Medical separation processing took 18 months, Colonel, Marcus replied quietly. Disability ratings were disputed multiple times. Veteran preference didn't translate to employment opportunities that matched my security clearance restrictions and physical limitations. The explanation revealed the bureaucratic nightmare that many wounded special operations veterans faced when transitioning to civilian life. Security clearances that had once opened doors to critical missions became obstacles to employment when combined with medical conditions and classification restrictions. Hayes shook his head in obvious disgust at the system failures that had reduced a legendary warrior to maintenance work. Sir, this is completely unacceptable. You should have support services and employment opportunities appropriate to your service and sacrifice. Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but had learned to manage expectations about veteran services and civilian understanding of special operations careers. His current employment provided income and purpose without the complications that came with recognition and the expectations that accompanied his legendary status. Patterson stood up from his chair, his movement carrying the formality of someone preparing to render appropriate military courtesy. Sir, permission to stand at attention for a genuine American hero. The request created immediate tension as the senior enlisted leader prepared to show respect that would fundamentally alter the dynamics between military personnel and the civilian contractor they now knew to be one of the most decorated warriors in American military history. Colonel Reeves found herself facing a situation that had no precedent in her military experience. The man sitting across from her had conducted operations that she had read about in classified briefings, missions that had shaped American foreign policy and saved countless lives through actions that could never be publicly acknowledged. The secure conference room had become the setting for a revelation that would change everything about how Fort Brennan personnel viewed the quiet maintenance worker who had been moving among them with skills and experience that dwarfed most of their own military careers combined. Marcus sat quietly as the weight of recognition settled over the room, knowing that his carefully constructed anonymity was forever shattered and that his remaining time at Fort Brennan will be fundamentally different from the peaceful obscurity he had briefly enjoyed. The transformation at Fort Brennan began within hours of the secure facility revelation, spreading through the base community with the speed that only military communications could achieve. Word of Hawk 8's presence had moved through unofficial channels, creating ripples of recognition and respect that fundamentally altered the social dynamics Marcus had navigated for weeks. Master Sergeant Patterson found Marcus in the maintenance supply room the following morning, but his approach carried none of the casual authority that had characterized their previous interactions. His bearing reflected the formal respect due to a warrior whose achievements had become legendary within special operations circles. "Sir, I wanted to personally apologize for any lack of appropriate recognition during your time here," Patterson said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "Had we known your identity and service record, your treatment would have been completely different." Marcus continued organizing cleaning supplies with the same methodical efficiency he had demonstrated since arriving at Fort Brennan, but his response carried appreciation for Patterson's courtesy. "Master Sergeant, I chose anonymity deliberately. The treatment I received was based on the information I provided, and that was my decision." The gracious response impressed Patterson further, confirming his assessment that genuine heroes often possessed humility that matched their extraordinary capabilities. Marcus's refusal to blame others for his temporary obscurity demonstrated character that transcended his military achievements. Sergeant Major Hayes appeared in the doorway, his expression showing the mixture of respect and embarrassment that had characterized senior leadership's reaction to discovering Hawk 8 among their civilian contractors. His presence indicated official recognition that would fundamentally change Marcus's status at the installation. "Staff Sergeant Castellano, Colonel Reeves requests your presence in her office at your earliest convenience," Hayes announced formally. "She has several matters to discuss regarding your current employment situation and available alternatives." Marcus nodded his understanding while recognizing that his peaceful anonymity was permanently shattered. The colonel's summons represented official acknowledgement that his maintenance contractor cover was no longer viable given the widespread knowledge of his true identity and legendary service record. The walk through Fort Brennan's corridors provided immediate evidence of how completely his social status had changed overnight. Personnel who had previously ignored his presence now stopped their conversations to watch him pass, their expressions showing recognition mixed with curiosity about the legendary warrior who had been working among them unrecognized. Lieutenant Torres intercepted Marcus near the administrative building entrance, his demeanor completely transformed from the skeptical authority he had previously displayed. His approach carried the nervous respect of someone seeking forgiveness for past discourtesy toward a genuine military hero. "Sir, I wanted to apologize for questioning your presence in restricted areas," Torres said awkwardly. "If I had known your clearance history and service record, I would never have challenged your access to any facility on this base." Marcus appreciated the young officer's courtesy, but recognized the wider implications of his exposed identity. The revelation of his background would create expectations and recognition that he had hoped to avoid through civilian employment and deliberate anonymity. "No apology necessary, Lieutenant," Marcus replied diplomatically. "You were following appropriate security procedures based on available information. Your diligence was commendable regardless of circumstances." Colonel Reeves's office reflected the organized efficiency of senior command leadership, but her greeting carried unprecedented warmth as she welcomed someone whose achievements had earned respect throughout the special operations community. Her demeanor showed genuine honor at hosting a warrior of Marcus's caliber. Staff Sergeant Castellano, please have a seat, the colonel said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair across from her desk. I have several opportunities to discuss that would better utilize your experience and provide recognition appropriate to your service record. Marcus settled into the offered chair while recognizing that his options were about to change dramatically. The colonel's tone suggested alternatives that would restore his professional status while acknowledging his legendary achievements and ongoing capabilities. First, I've contacted Veteran Services about your disability processing and employment support. Colonel Reeves continued. Your case will receive priority review to ensure you receive all benefits and services appropriate to your service and sacrifice. The intervention represented official recognition that Marcus's current circumstances resulted from system failures rather than personal shortcomings. His legendary service record would now open doors that had previously remained closed due to bureaucratic obstacles and inadequate veteran support. Additionally, several defense contractors have expressed interest in consulting positions that would utilize your specialized knowledge while accommodating any physical limitations from your service-connected injuries. The opportunities represented restoration of professional status that matched Marcus's capabilities and experience, though he wondered whether civilian employment could provide the sense of purpose that military service had once offered. Captain Webb appeared in the colonel's outer office, his presence creating an uncomfortable moment as everyone present remembered his persistent challenges to Marcus's legitimacy and competence. His expression showed the particular embarrassment of someone whose judgment had been spectacularly wrong about a matter of fundamental importance. Colonel, I wanted to personally apologize to Staff Sergeant Castellano for my inappropriate skepticism regarding his background and qualifications, Webb said formally. My concerns were based on incomplete information and poor judgment. Marcus stood to acknowledge Webb's apology, his response demonstrating the grace that often characterized genuine heroes when dealing with those who had doubted them. His courtesy transcended personal offense and focused on professional reconciliation. Captain, your security diligence was appropriate given available information, Marcus replied diplomatically. No offense was taken, and no apology is necessary. The exchange highlighted the transformation in base dynamics as personnel adjusted to the revelation that their assumptions about the civilian contractor had been completely wrong. Marcus's legendary status was reshaping every relationship and creating new expectations about his future role. If this story moved you, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or character, or share if you've witnessed similar situations where someone's true worth was initially unrecognized in your own community. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself at the center of attention that he had hoped to avoid through civilian employment and deliberate anonymity. But the recognition also opened possibilities for meaningful work that could utilize his extraordinary skills while providing purpose that matched his capabilities and experience. The maintenance contractor who had been dismissed and overlooked for weeks was now recognized as one of the most decorated warriors in American military history. His legendary call sign Hawk 8 would be spoken with reverence throughout Fort Brennan, ensuring that his true worth would never again be underestimated or ignored. The quiet hero had been revealed, transforming not only his own circumstances but also the perspectives of everyone who had witnessed the power of earned recognition and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to discover the extraordinary individuals who sometimes move among us unrecognized.